When our eyes met, I felt that I was growing pale. A curious instinct of terror came over me. I knew that I had come face to face with someone whose mere personality was so fascinating that if I allowed it to do so, it would absorb my whole nature, my whole soul, my very art itself. And just who was that fascinating, mysterious figure? Well, it could be none other than Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray. This episode of History by the Book. Now, in the preface of the story, Wilde argues that it is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. Now, what Wilde's talking about here is the ideology or philosophy or theory, however you want to refer to it as, of aestheticism. And aestheticism is the theory or belief that art should be about beauty. Regardless of the subject matter, it is the beauty in art that is what is important. And this is what Wilde meant when he said all art is quite useless. Art wasn't meant to be used as an instruction or representation of the way things should be. Art was supposed to be about, well, art. Now, in an 1882 interview with an American newspaper, Wilde was discussing the idea of aestheticism versus public opinion. And during that interview, Wilde stated, "Go and look at the statue of Venus de Medici, and you know it is an exquisitely beautiful creation. Would it change your opinion in the least if all the newspapers in the land should pronounce it a wretched caricature?" Now, to Wilde, the purpose of art was simply to be art. Yet when Wilde's only novel featuring art was published, it was subject to harsh criticism from both critics and the public. Now, The Picture of Dorian Gray was originally published in 1890 as a novella for Lippincott's Monthly Magazine, which was a literary journal that was based in Philadelphia. Now, the magazine had a readership on both sides of the pond. And although Wilde was already known for his writing, his wit, and, let's face it, his impeccable sense of fashion, his latest work wasn't exactly received kindly by the critics. Some of them called it stupid and vulgar, while others said it reeked of moral and spiritual putrefaction. Now, Wilde was undeterred by the criticism that he received, and as a matter of fact, he expanded The Picture of Dorian Gray from a 13-chapter novella to a 20-chapter standalone novel that would be published by Locke, Ward and Company in 1891. Now, Wilde probably knew he was opening himself up to some pretty severe criticism once the novel was published. So why would he write it in the first place? Well, the credit for that goes to J.M. Stoddard, the American publisher who was eager to expand Lippincott's readership over in England. And on August 30th, 1889, Stoddard invited 3 writers to a dinner at the Langham Hotel. Now, the 3 writers he invited were Oscar Wilde, Arthur Conan Doyle, yet to be known as Sir, and the third one who couldn't make it for whatever reason, and his name was Rudyard Kipling. Now, at the time, Doyle had already published A Study in Scarlet, the first Sherlock Holmes adventure, and ironically, that story received a pretty lukewarm reception. And Doyle was by no means the household name that he would later become. Now, Doyle was somewhat starstruck by Wilde's charisma and delighted, if not a little bit surprised, that Wilde had read his historical novel, Micah Clarke, a work that has since kind of faded into literary obscurity. And not only had he read it, Wilde actually said that he liked it. And Doyle was so enchanted by the whole experience that he started to refer to that evening as the Golden Night. And he stated that Wilde had left an indelible impression upon my mind. Now, that night, Stoddard secured agreements from both Wilde and Doyle to write stories for Lippincott's. And if you've been paying attention, then you know that Oscar Wilde's contribution was The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Arthur Conan Doyle's was The Sign of Four, the second Sherlock Holmes adventure. Now, while Stoddard provided the opportunity, Wilde's inspiration for the story came from a personal experience. In 1887, Wilde sat to have his portrait painted by a Canadian artist named Francis Richards. And once the painting was finished, Wilde turned and looked at it, and he commented, "What a tragic thing it is. This portrait will never grow older, and I shall. If only it was the other way." The moment I had said this, it occurred to me what a capital plot the idea would make for a story. And if you'd like to see that portrait, well, dear reader, I have the misfortune of informing you that that portrait has been lost to history. We know why Wilde wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, and we know what inspired the idea for the story. But what about Dorian Gray himself? Was he a real person that Wilde knew? Well, the answer to that, like most things in life, is it's complicated. Now, in 1889, as Wilde was writing Dorian Gray, he was introduced to a young man named John Gray. Now, John Gray also had poetic aspirations, and he also had an abundance of masculine beauty, which quickly caught Wilde's eye. Now, Wilde became kind of infatuated with him and agreed to pay for the publishing of John Gray's poems. Now, Wilde may have given his character, Dorian Gray, John Gray's surname as a way of flattering him. And John Gray was quick to pick up on the cue by signing all his letters to Oscar Wilde as Dorian. Now, this was great until a newspaper called The Star suggested that John Gray was in fact the inspiration for the character of Dorian Gray. Now, John Gray was kind of horrified by this, and he threatened to sue the newspaper for libel, and he also asked Wilde to step in and try to debunk this rumor that was going on. And Wilde did that. Wilde wrote a letter stating that Gray was nothing more than a casual acquaintance. Now, whatever their relationship was, in 1893, when Gray did publish his poems, he did it without Wilde's backing. But that wasn't going to be the end of the controversy for this book, because unfortunately for Wilde, the homoerotic tones in Dorian Gray would be used against him. Now, during his infamous 1895 trial for gross indecency, the novel was cited as evidence against him, and when the prosecutor stated that the novel was perverse and evidence of his immorality, Wilde fiercely defended his work by stating that only brutes and illiterates would interpret it that way. Now, Wilde was convicted and sentenced to 2 years hard labor on May 25th, 1895. And Wilde's time in prison took a heavy toll on him physically as well as mentally. Wilde was forced to spend long hours walking on a treadmill or picking oakum. And picking oakum was the process of taking naval ropes that had been coated in tar and picking them apart fiber by fiber. And this, of course, would lead to getting fiber splinters in your hands. Your nails would be broken and bleeding from picking at the tar, and your hands would become very sore from repeating the same motion over and over. So imagine doing this for hours on end, day after day. And after a while, it did take a toll on Oscar's health, and he was so exhausted at one point that he collapsed and fell and hit his head and ruptured his eardrum. Now, shortly after that happened, Wilde was transferred to Reading Jail. But while he was standing on the platform, waiting for the train that would take him to Reading, he was subjected to jeers and being spat at by other people on the platform. And Wilde would later describe this as one of the most humiliating and soul-crushing things that has ever happened to him. Now, when Wilde got to Reading, the once known Lord of Language was now reduced merely to being known as prisoner C33, which was his cell number. Now, Wilde's mind and body may have been broken, but his soul poured itself out into one of the most magnificent pieces of writing ever, and that was De Profundis. Now, if you haven't read De Profundis, I would highly, highly encourage you to go and check it out, even if you only read a couple of pages of it. It started out as a letter to Lord Alfred Douglas and quickly expanded into this magnificent essay. And if you want to know the heart and soul of Wilde, that's where you're going to find it. So if you haven't read De Profundis, go and check it out. I promise it will be an experience. But that wasn't the only thing that came out of Wilde's time in behind bars. Now, after he was released on May 18, 1897, Wilde immediately left for France. And it was there that he wrote the haunting poem, The Ballad of Reading Jail. And this is something else I would really encourage you to go and check out, because it is a really haunting piece of writing, and it really gives you some insight to the things that Wilde had experienced while he was behind bars. Now, Wilde's time outside of jail wouldn't be long. He would die on November 30th, 1900 in Paris, and he would eventually be laid in his final resting place at Père Lachaise Cemetery. Now, in 1918, Edith Ellis wrote a defense of Oscar Wilde, declaring Wilde was a protest against the current and ugly smugness, and that he held a torch which could illuminate the vague face of beauty for many who were half-witted or short-sighted. And I love that, because I think that's exactly what Wilde was trying to do. Oscar Wilde wanted to show people how to appreciate beauty, whether it was in art or literature or even within themselves, by breaking social boundaries. Unfortunately, society was a little too comfortable in those boundaries, and Oscar became a scapegoat for them to hang their hatred and ignorance on. Now, in the years since, Wilde's legacy has been re-examined, and finally Oscar has received the praise and respect that's been due to him. In 1995, Wilde was commemorated in a stained glass window that is in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. And in 2017, Wilde, along with thousands of others convicted of draconian historical anti-LGBTQ+ laws, was granted a long overdue pardon. So, do you have a favorite work from Oscar Wilde? I think mine is probably De Profundis, closely followed by The Picture of Dorian Gray. But I'd like to know what yours is, so let me know in the comments below. I want to say thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on History by the Book.